said a lot of really cool things about the printing press, and one thing that made my ear perk up was you said a lot of people thought like Web 2 or the internet is the reinvention of the printing press, but you said it's not. It's really what we're doing in Web 3. And I'd like you to dive a little bit more into that.
Sure. And this kind of gets back into like the idea of how history works. It's not as if there's one thing and then bam, there's another thing. That tends not to be how it works. You tend to have these little false starts historically, right? There are a lot of different renaissances. There's a lot of like people working in different value, trying to recreate their society, doing different things of art, You have these false starts basically, right? And then the last one that eclipsed all the others was successful because it used a decentralized form of all those other things. That meant it couldn't be stamped out, and the technology intersecting with community had a generative function. And so you would have had kind of centralized false starts in different aspects of the last Renaissance, right? So maybe that sounds familiar if we're in Middle Ages right now and we've seen like centralized false starts where there's potential to do things, but doesn't quite play out like we had hoped it would, and it ends up just kind of working into the system where it actually generates more for the medieval lords rather than for the farmers in the fields, right? Like that's kind of the way you can look at the internet as a potential, but because it wasn't decentralized in terms of value accrual and like permissionless nature of the communication, it did amazing things, but I think that's small potatoes compared to what we'll see. And specifically around that, like you can look at like some real specific examples of like that. Everyone will point to the internet and say, hey, you can do these new business models, which tend to be advertising because ownership is stripped away from that, or you can work remotely, and all these things are true. And you can have these different changes at like societal levels, like political, maybe it's Arab Spring, It's like in that example, that won't happen again. Like that now that happened, like regimes are giving lessons to one another how to cut the broadcast layer in the cord, right? Like there's a broadcast layer to Web3 and that can be cut. But now we're starting to see for the first time with Web3 distributed broadcast with different systems like little nodes, distributed VPNs and things like that. And then the same thing like with domain and DNS and ENS and unstoppable domains and a whole host of people doing this. Like when you take the weak form, the centralized version of it, and it hasn't quite worked out like we wanted to, or even though we look at it and we say, oh, it has massive adoption, it's still nothing compared to what it could have been or what it would be what it will be in the future. Like using the decentralized nature as a form of the same technology, like that's a more historically appropriate analog than the printing press. The printing press wasn't centralized by 4 networks that dominated 90% of the printed traffic. That wasn't the way it worked. It was geographically diverse, and people actually had ownership in those different assets in the printing pieces. And so if I compare it to the internet, I say this smells much more, or it looks much more like like an early start. And part of that's just like our point in the historical clock, right? Like we just happen to be born where we see the internet and we say, wow. But if you take a step back, you say, that's like 40 years maybe, and you've really only had adoption like at scale for 30 years. You've really only had new business models for 20. That's like that, like historically in terms of epoch, that like really reads like a little false start. And so like now when we see crypto, not just changing value, but like allowing us to change communication at a technical level, and then weave in value with communication, that strikes me as like something that is much more akin to what we saw with the printing press meeting ledger-based finance in the Renaissance. And then, of course, now we have ownership in that same piece, which is just like Plutonia. That's something we have never seen before. So I don't know, does that make sense?
It does make sense. I mean, something, I guess, something I'm trying to figure out with the printing press, and maybe it's just because I don't know enough about it, is like, would anyone try to argue that the printing press was more decentralized than like the current version of the internet? And I just asked that because like, yes, we can all post articles on Medium. We can all share posts on Facebook and Twitter, but you've mentioned a couple of times, like it is coming through those central rails. Like there's probably, I don't know, I'm just throwing out a number. There's probably 20 major websites where all the posting happens. And yes, we have access to those, but it is happening through like central ones, whereas it sounds like the printing press was happening in a much more decentralized way. Like there was not everyone owned a printing press, but there were printing presses scattered throughout the countries, and they were all responsible for printing different kinds of articles, topics, essays, perspectives, artwork. So from that standpoint, the funnel of communication wasn't happening through like the same channels, that the channels were distributed, even though today more people can post.
Yeah. The reason why the printing press worked was because it wasn't four main printers that would have been like having four main scriptoria. Like the reason why the printing press worked is because it was much more decentralized. That you could machine a press and create it and go in the back room of a shop and be off to the races, with like not a tremendous amount of capital. Like the best modern analogy is like running a node, basically. Not even a hardcore like tech node, even like a no code node. Yeah, it costs you a few $100 and you have to figure something out, but it's not as if you have to be into it. And that's why. So when this new information is coming out, which says, hey, the authority figure is illegitimate and there's an alternative, society you can create, they would have stamped that out, and they tried to hit, depending upon how far you want to go into it. It was centralized when it started out. They squashed some of those folks down because the tech was decentralized. Other people popped up, a longer tail of it in a distribution curve, and it proved super resilient. And so then the authorities had to say, hey, we can't stop this. Like we could always stop monks writing manuscripts. We could stop it if it were a few printing presses. We could outlaw it even in a couple cities and work with the city authorities and the governments and blah, blah. But we've tried that, and that doesn't work because the technology is so decentralized. We can't stamp it out. So now what do? We're faced with a choice. Do we let it run, or do we participate in the same media and thereby legitimize the action on it? And they did that, which ultimately proved to be their downfall. And then one other thing you said, which is really really interesting. You might not be writing, you might not even be literate, but these printing presses, like they were formed not just with one person in a shop. They were formed like through these networks. It was like Luther and his buddies, and here's an artist, and here's the small biz guy, and he's doing the printing, the other guys. So there were like these networks forming around the creation of, like, listen if this sounds familiar, like around the creation of like ideas and images. Most of them, if you look at the printed material, like you sort through the data, you'd say most of it is memes, basically. These networks are forming. You might not be able to code or to print, but you can be an artist and sketch this out, or you can do some of the dissemination. And what was really interesting was they tended to tie the ownership to those networks. And so you'd be printing, it was much more decentralized, but they were also better at capturing the value of what they created through that like alternative like thought structure. Where I would argue not only is our current internet much more centralized, but we're horrible at capturing the value from that, right? And so like most of the value goes in total addressable market of some FANG stock. And so part of the decentralized nature is like technical, but part of it is the value accrual. Like in that sense, even if they don't cut your cord, like they're functioning like medieval lords, they'll let you keep talking, and like through magic, through like alchemaic, like hocus pocus, they'll use an algorithm to shape what you see versus what you don't see to create behavior in you. That's like better hegemony than like any medieval like regime could have ever come up with. Or they'll let you keep talking, and they'll just harvest the fruits of your interaction like you're a peasant out in the fields. So yeah, I'd say we're very medieval technically, to your point, but also even kind of value accrual. And like medieval chump you, like way back then, who didn't realize your permission, like so too, we don't even think about it. We're like, wait, what? Is that true?
Yeah.
Like,
I guess like, and it's almost something we are just on the cusp. I think we're just on the cusp of seeing this in Web3, is creating your own owning your own smart contract. So you talk about these printing presses, like you literally had to build the printing press to print the thing you wanted to say. And that's why, it couldn't be that one press couldn't be all over Europe, because I guess everyone would have to reproduce it. So you created your press, you printed your book, and then you literally went and sold that book. Whereas other people had their own print going, they were selling their own things. So they were capturing that value. And now,
oh, sorry, keep going.
I feel like now, like low and no code applications are very big in Web 2 world, like being able to stand up a website simply. And from a lot of conversations I'm having with like builders in the space, a lot of people are thinking about how do we give power to creators so they own their own smart contract. Instead of just being able to list through OpenSea and their smart contract, you should own yours. And if that gets to the point where it's, click a couple buttons and plug and play, and then all of a sudden we're all going to start owning our own contracts, and then furthermore like owning our own data and publishings, that takes that ownership level to just really an exponential level than where we are today.
You're listening to the Unstoppable Podcast,
the go-to place for everyone to learn about the latest innovations in Web3, NFTs, and the decentralized web. Welcome to the metaverse.